Hello and welcome to this video. I'm going to be talking about the astrological correspondences of the Thoth court cards. In the previous video, I looked at that elemental classification and produced a table like this, where each of the court cards in turn was classified according to two elements. So for this particular video, I'm going to be looking at the astrological correspondences, and that includes everything but the princesses. And they don't have a direct astrological correspondence, but they do correspond to areas of space above the North Pole and also land masses. So I'll go through those at the end of the video, but talk about the other 12 court cards in relation to the astrological wheel. This is a decan wheel that I've used for the Minor Arcana series that I've done, and it's probably the best one that I've seen on the internet. It's absolutely beautifully done, with the astrological signs in the middle here, and even their Cardinal, fixed and mutable classification, and that is actually relevant to this particular video. So the actual Minor Arcana are around the circumference of the wheel, each one occupying 10 degrees. So for instance, with the Eight of Wands here, we've got Mercury in Sagittarius. So here it's represented here, Mercury in Sagittarius. But the thing that this wheel doesn't have is the court cards, princesses and aces that are placed on it. So I've done one specifically relating to the Thoth deck that places them all on. And so we see in this diagram, the court cards form a circumference around the Minor Arcana. The Minor Arcana are all in here, obviously apart from the aces. And this is the time slots that each of the court cards rules. The red is indicating the zodiac signs that are associated with the element fire, the blue with water, yellow with air, and green with the earth. Now outside the circumference of these 12 court cards lie the princesses, because as I said, they don't occupy and rule units of time, they rule units of space, along with the respective ace of that particular suit. So one thing to bear in mind when we look at this wheel, if we take Sagittarius and the Knight of Wands, for example, we might think that the Knight of Wands should occupy the whole of a fire sign, but it doesn't. It occupies the first two decans, not 20 degrees, of Sagittarius, but it begins with the water sign of Scorpio. So the Knight of Wands consists of 1 part water and 2 parts fire. The Queen of Discs, relating to Earth, is made up of 1 part fire and 2 parts water. So you have this mixture, just like we did with the elements here. We have a further mixture astrologically. And so through the court cards, the elements are connected together rather than separated from one another. And effectively, each court card is not allowed to rule any particular sign. Rather, they just bind this wheel together by connecting the elements. So the next thing to consider about the astrology of these 12 court cards and their respective signs is the actual nature of the sign itself. Again, taking the Knight of Wands, for example. The Knight of Wands is fire of fire, and the most active, dynamic fire sign on the zodiac is Aries. And then it goes to Leo, which is a fixed, steady input of the energy of fire, and then you get the mutable Sagittarius, which is the weakest. So instead of being associated with the strongest of the fire signs, being fire of fire, it's actually associated with the weakest. And this happens for each of the court cards, but I'm not going to go through each one in turn because the separate videos will do that. I'm just using this one example here. So we need to understand why this relationship between the strongest is being associated with the weakness or the weaker of the signs on the deccan wheel. So in order to do that, we need to look at some Hindu philosophy, which Crowley talks about, and he associates the court cards with the three gunas, which are rajas, tamas and sattvas. Rajas are essentially the force to change or activity, and that's where you get the knights on horseback. Tamas represent inertia, sometimes stagnation, and it's associated with the queens sitting on a throne. And sattvas represent the balance and harmony and creativeness. So the three gunas are essentially three qualities of virtues of nature. And just as we had the balancing of elements through the Knight of Wands being partly associated with Scorpio here, as well as Sagittarius, so we have a balance of energies concerning the actual nature of the fire sign as well. So if we just demonstrate this by example, we have a flower here, the roots and stem. So the tamas, or the inertia, is associated with the Queen of Wands and the roots of the flower. The Knight of Wands is associated with the raw energy, the action, change, movement, as we see in the Knight here, and that's the rajas. And the Prince of Wands is associated with the flower, which is the harmony, beingness and purity. That's the combining of the two. So that's how the court cards relate to those three energies, and it's the balancing of those energies that's important. But before we put the final bit into the mix, we'll just have a look at what is meant by cardinal, fixed and mutable, because some people will know and some won't. So when I said at the start that this information was relevant to this video, this is where it comes in. It was presented on the first decan wheel here. So these cardinal, fixed, mutable are referred to as quadruplicities because they are groups of 4 signs associated with each. With the cardinal signs, they're known as initiators of the energy of the element. And they're associated also with north, south, east and west, the cardinal points of the compass. The times when the seasons change, so we've got Aries for spring, Cancer for summer, Libra for autumn, Capricorn for winter. So it's that initial drive into the season. So there are times of a new beginning, a new impulse of energy, and that's where you'd think the Knight of Wands would be associated with. The fixed signs represent stability of the energy, such as Leo, Taurus, Aquarius and Scorpio. And the mutable signs mean subject to change, and the key word for these is adaptability. And indeed Sagittarius, which the Knight of Wands is associated with, is the weakest and most changeable of the signs. So I'm going to put that all together in this classification of these 12 court cards and say really that the Knights are associated with the Cardinal, the Queen's the fixed, and the Princes are mutable, as we saw in the flower diagram. And its respective guna is Ragistic, the Queens are Tamasic, and the Princess Sattvic. The alchemical equivalents here are talked about in the Major Arcana series. So the rulership is the last, again just taking this Knight of Wands, is the last 10 degrees of a fixed sign and the first 20 degrees of a mutable sign. And I'll just go back to this diagram here. So it's the last 10 degrees of a fixed sign, which is Scorpio. This is its first 10 degrees, second 10 degrees, and this is third 10 degrees. So it's the last decan of Scorpio and the first 20 degrees of a mutable sign, which is Sagittarius. So look at what we've got here for the Knights. We've got Cardinal, fixed, and mutable. So what it is doing by placing the Knight in the mutable sign of Sagittarius, it's balancing out these three energies of Cardinal, fixed, and mutable. Just as in the first diagram here, you had this linking of the energies of each sign. So not only are they bound together rather than separated, you also get a balancing of energies in terms of the three gunas and the energies of Cardinal, fixed, and mutable. If we look at the Queen's, its quadruplicity group is fixed. Queens are fixed here in the roots, associated with Tamas. If we go back to the main diagram here, they are associated with the cardinal sign of Libra and the mutable sign of Virgo. Okay, so again we have this balance between its fixed nature and what it rules. It rules 10 degrees of a mutable sign and 20 degrees of a cardinal sign. And the same with the princes. They are mutable, but they rule 10 degrees of a cardinal and 20 degrees of a fixed. So all this is essentially doing is trying to balance out the energies within the decan wheel. So now I'll just talk about the princesses. The princesses, which are my favourite, the princesses rule 90-degree quadrants of space around the North Pole, and they are centred around the fixed signs. So these are the princesses here, and they're on a circumference outside of the court cards along with their aces. And they have the following associations. The Princess of Wands rules the space where you have Cancer, Leo and Virgo. So you have Cancer, Leo and Virgo, and it's centered around the fixed sign of Leo. Here you see it's right in the center, but we're talking about quadrants of space here. And similar for the Princess of Cups here, it's centered around the fixed water sign of Scorpio, and so on for the other two signs and their respective elements. And this quadrant of space, this 90-degree quadrant of space, is centered around the celestial North Pole. I'll try and put that in a 3D diagram for you. So here we have the Earth in the center here with the North Pole, and all of these quadrants are leading back to the North Pole. Here we have Leo and the Princess of Wands occupying a 90-degree quadrant with respect to the North Pole. Taurus is the fixed sign for Earth, Aquarius for air, and Scorpio for water. So that gives you some idea of the space in which the princesses occupy. I also did a picture to see how that would work out in relation to the top of the Earth. And we get something like this. And this brings us on to the second thing that the princesses rule over. Not just space, they rule over landmass, because the princesses are associated with Earth, and therefore they rule the land masses within these 90-degree quadrants that we saw in the previous 3D diagram here. So essentially what it says in the Book of Thoth is that the meridian is the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now what a meridian is essentially a straight line that goes from the Pyramid of Giza through both of the poles. So I've drawn it in here. Here's the Pyramid of Giza roughly in Egypt, North Africa, goes through the North Pole, it'll go across here and around to the South Pole and back again. Now if the princesses occupy 90 degrees, it's got to be 90 degrees relative to the meridian. And this gives us the land masses that Crowley says the princesses occupy. So in the Book of Thoth it states that the Princess of Wands rules the area of Asia, Princess of Cups the Pacific, Princess of Swords the Americas, and the Princess of Discs rules the areas of Europe and Africa, and says that that is a rough thing. So when I did this diagram here, so Princess of Wands rules Asia, you can see that it rules Asia here. Princess of Cups, we have the Pacific Ocean, Princess of Swords the Americas, and the Princess of Discs, Europe and Africa, as it says down here. So doing this diagram, it seems to pretty much work out in terms of the correspondence between the landmass and the princesses. So that essentially concludes this video.